Well, welcome. We have a good crowd. It's an honor for me to introduce the speaker for today. Professor Lois Rosau is a specialist in French opera of the 17th and 18th centuries. However, she has multiple publications in the text and music as it relates to musicology. She has been very actively involved with performance practices, engraving, and a number of other activities in at Ohio State University. She got her undergraduate degree at Oberlin College and then earned her PhD at Brandeis University. She was on the faculty at UCLA, but then we were fortunate that she has come to Ohio State University and served on the faculty from 1985 until 2014. She headed the musicology area for 18 years and was responsible for a development of a graduate program in ethnomusicology. She currently remains active in service, in retirement, and professional activities. Most notably, she's the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the 17th Century Music, and she's also president of the Board of Trustees of the Concert Society Early Music in Columbus, which is relevant, I believe, to her topic today, which is early music as a scholarly pursuit. So, Professor Rosau, thank you very much for this, and I'm looking forward to your lecture.
Hello, everyone. The term early music is odd. Is there such a thing as late music? Or perhaps right on time music? The term originated in England around the 1880s. The Dutch and Germans say old music. The French say ancient music. In general, these terms refer to a niche variety of what is commonly called classical music. Whoops, how'd that happen? There we are. A niche variety of what is commonly called classical music, music composed before a certain date. So old music, as the Germans and Dutch say. The cutoff date varies depending on when and whom you ask, but most writers and concert presenters today think early music ends around the year 1800. The term means something more than chronology. Specialist practitioners aim to recreate the performance styles of the past using replicas of period instruments. On the slide, I used the term early music movement. More about that later. It really did become a movement. It's a vast topic. In order to make it manageable, I decided to focus here on the 17th and 18th centuries, both because they have an interesting story to tell and also because as a scholar, I live in those centuries. If you want to know why I put scare quotes around the style period names, ask me later. Okay. A couple of personal caveats. Many of the best scholars of early music performance are also serious performers of early music. That is not me. I come to this topic solely as a musicologist. Second, this is not a report on my research. My research overlaps with this topic, but that's not the story I plan to tell. There is an enormous primary and secondary literature. Everybody can read about early music performance. Beyond that, though, I have lived through a good part of the story that gets really interesting, beginning in the 1960s. So I can call myself a witness as well as a reader. So let's start with a piece of music by way of introduction. How many people here have ever heard of Mouret? Oh, a few hands, that's nice. Most of you will recognize this piece, whether you've heard of Mouret or not. Let's play the music. Sorry about that cutoff. I didn't fade out very well. Okay, so let's change the slide so we see where you all recognize it from. Yes, the theme music on Masterpiece Theater. 1954 recording, it didn't sound great, did it? We're doing pretty well to be able to hear it at all. So the performance uses modern instruments. The director did not bother with the partially improvised sort of Baroque accompaniment called a basso continuo. But there it is, and people like it. Masterpiece Theater popularized this music. It is frequently used as a wedding march, so there are arrangements for church organ. In fact, you can go to YouTube, you will find a gazillion arrangements for all sorts of instruments. It's really quite astonishing. But how might this piece have sounded in the 18th century? That's my topic here. We need to pay attention to context. Mouret dedicated the engraved edition to a patron who was a retired military officer, and he says in his dedication that this is to remind you of your glory days on the battlefield, hence the trumpets and timpani. But there's no place for violins on the parade ground, especially in the 18th century. All the music that was literally for marching soldiers was played by drums and loud wind instruments. So this is indoor entertainment music. It's a piece for the chamber. And in that context, a French march was supposed to evoke the dance. Not that audiences actually got up and danced, but they thought of dancers marching on stage in a ballet or an opera. So how are we going to suggest the lilt of a dance? In French music of the period, stepwise eighth notes were notated as simple eighth notes, as even eighth notes, but nearly always played in a dotted rhythm. Da, 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 da. It was just the practice. It was what you did. They called them notes inégales, unequal notes. I have found only one performance that, in my opinion, captures the spirit of 18th century France. We're going to hear the timbre of Baroque trumpets. We're even going to hear a little bit of the sort of mistake you might make as a Baroque trumpeter with no valves, changing the pitch only with your lips. But it's okay, they basically play very well. And the timpani to evoke the military imagery. And there will be the gentle swing to evoke the march as a dance. Ironically, this performance includes no strings or woodwinds. It's just a continuo group of viola da gamba, which is a bowed instrument, theorbo, which is a large lute, and a chamber organ, a small organ. The melodic parts for violin and oboe in Mouret's score are played here by the continuo organ. This is a kind of substitution that might well have been made in the 18th century. Once you publish this piece and people have it in their own homes, they use whatever they've got. Not everybody had a bunch of violins and cellos and oboes and bassoons. Okay, let's listen to it. Different, huh? Yeah. I find the camera work perplexing. I mean, Hild Perla is a wonderful gamba player, but the notion that we're going to focus on the continuo bass the whole time seems really weird to me. But anyway, I should mention that all the videos I'm going to show you come from YouTube. YouTube is an amazing resource for early music. Not just performances, but explanatory stuff. I mean, you want to know how the 18th century clarinet developed and worked. I'm not going to talk about that, but boy, you can find out on YouTube. So I recommend it. Three general subjects are introduced by our glance at Mouret's rondo: repertoire, instruments, and performance practice. So I'm going to expand a little bit on each of those. Repertoire. People talk about the test of time. Did that piece of music survive the test of time? Before the 19th century, there was no test of time. Earlier than that, people performed a piece of music as long as it was in style. When it was out of style, they put it away. Sort of like, pop music in the 1950s before there was such a thing as classic rock. You listened to what was new, and then you put it away. I didn't say throw it away because manuscripts were very expensive. They probably, put it in a trunk or something, the way what you did with your clothes that had gone out of style. So in the 17th and 18th century, style changes much more rapidly than earlier. In Middle Ages and Renaissance, a manuscript of music might have been used for several decades before style changed enough that got put away. 17th and 18th centuries, we're talking maybe 20 years. So fast changes of style. And with very few exceptions, what people wanted to hear was the newest of the new. Somebody hired to direct a music ensemble, say for a court of a member of the nobility or for a church, was expected to be a composer as well as a performer, was expected to provide new music all the time. And yes, you could drag out old things and repeat them from time to time, but you couldn't do so much of that your employer noticed. The notion of musical classics, that we prize old music, starts slowly in the 18th century and then completely takes over in the 19th century. In London, there was something called the Academy of Ancient Music. It started in the 1720s, lasted until 1802. And what was ancient music? What was the oldest thing they played? Corelli. You know, music from the very end of the previous century and the beginning of the 18th. And then as the 18th century moved on, they played Geminiani, you know, they just added Handel, whatever, you know, they could call ancient music. You might know the name Academy of Ancient Music for its more modern incarnation as the name of a Baroque orchestra. But that's what it's based on, the old Academy of Ancient Music. Mozart and Haydn never stopped being performed. So there's a continuous tradition. Now, it's not a continuous performance style tradition, but it's a continuous tradition of performing them. They stay around all through the 19th century and on into the 20th century. And in the 19th century, there's a gradual introduction of more and more music from the past. Concert societies discover Palestrina, you know, Renaissance choral music, for instance. Johann Sebastian Bach's keyboard music, so he's first half of the 18th century, his keyboard music, some of his violin music had never stopped being played. So, you know, 18th century, they're kind of beginning with this holding on to music thing. But his church pieces for choir and orchestra were completely unknown. You know, they weren't printed. It's a manuscript with the choir and all this orchestral music. It's sitting even in those days in an archive after he died. Into the 19th century, until Felix Mendelssohn, at the age of 20, directed Bach's Matthew Passion in Berlin, 1829. And people said, "You're crazy. You're going to Bach, you know, this couple hours piece." He didn't do the whole thing. His was only a couple hours. But people loved it. It caused a sensation. And it began a Bach revival, an incredible Bach revival, digging up more old music by Bach. There was a complete works edition of Bach's music that started, musicologists doing this, started in the middle of the 19th century. And gradually, as the 19th century goes on, turns into the 20th century, this continues. More and more unknown old music is brought to light. This is not a matter of, you know, the romantic notion of discovering something unknown in a trunk in an attic. These are pieces that were sitting in libraries and archives just waiting for somebody to notice them. And they did. In my graduate student days in the 70s, there was a vogue for uncovering minor masters of the Renaissance. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but I kind of walked into it as a graduate student. People just went looking for, oh, we don't know the music of this guy. And, you know, they pull it out. A musicologist by the name of Joseph Kerman had nothing but contempt for this activity. He said, "They are foraging deer, going from one meadow to the next, looking for new blades of grass." I think what Kerman really didn't like was what we were doing with the music once we found it, but that's a whole different lecture topic. So that's repertoire. Moving on to instruments. A gradual interest forms in the 19th century of well, if we're going to play this old music, maybe we should try to play it on the old instruments. They started with Baroque instruments. There were some old violas da gamba and harpsichords around, most of them barely playable, but they could sort of do this. But then we come to two big names that I do want to mention. There are a bunch of people involved in this. I don't want to suggest that it's only these two, but these are the names I want to mention. They span the late 19th to the early 20th century. Wanda Landowska, who had an international career in Europe as a virtuoso concert pianist, and then she takes up the harpsichord, and that word really needs to be in scare quotes. Look at that picture. Her harpsichord was made by the piano maker Pleyel. It had a metal undergirding like a piano of the time. Look at all those pedals. It was some sort of weird cross between a harpsichord and a piano. People couldn't quite imagine that this delicate thing in the museums could make music that anyone wanted to listen to. So they had to do this to it. She thought that she was playing Bach as Bach would have wanted it. She was playing it as she wanted it. Okay. But Landowska escaped the Nazis somehow with one instrument. I think a student of hers managed to send the instrument after her on a boat. I don't know what year in the 30s. So she ended up in America with one instrument, and that's it. It ended up in the Metropolitan Museum. Arnold Dolmetsch. He was French, but he spent most of his adult life in England. He decided he was going to be a builder of instruments, basically wooden instruments. He made viols, he made recorders, he made all the keyboard instruments. He was extremely eccentric. He never tried to get an academic position, and it's a good thing because he would not have withstood the hierarchy. He wanted to be his own man. He spent most of his productive life at his country estate in Haslemere, England, in Surrey. He was famous. People made pilgrimages to Haslemere to talk to him and hear the instruments and buy instruments from him because he was making his living as a builder. His family, there are other pictures of his family all dressed up in Elizabethan garb, performing this or that. They all kind of participated at these little concerts. Mostly thanks to Dolmetsch, there was a new popularity of these old instruments. And instrument societies developed. There was a recorder society in England and a viola da gamba society and so forth. He also wrote about the performance of old music, which is our next topic. He got a lot wrong, but he was a pioneer. Instrument making changes radically in the 1960s. Hang on to that thought. So, performance practice. The study and application of historical performance techniques. That's a definition. In particular, those that aren't notated. So you have a notated music, and what do you know to do or find out to do that isn't on the paper? That's performance practice. Music notation has gradually changed over the centuries to include more and more information. In the early Middle Ages, you got words and you were lucky to get pitches. You certainly didn't get rhythm. Later in the Middle Ages, you start getting some rhythm. Middle Ages and Renaissance, there's a pitch system. You've all heard of the gamut with Guido's hand, all of that stuff. The pitch system didn't include every note. Some notes had to be added in by the performer because they knew how to do it. They called it musica ficta, false music. So we, as performer scholars, have to learn the rules of musica ficta if we're going to sing from that notation or make a modern edition from that notation. Text underlay. You look at the old manuscripts of some piece, some lovely choral piece by Palestrina, and there's a place where one syllable is held out for all kinds of notes. We call it a melisma. The manuscripts didn't show you where to put the syllables on all these strings of notes. So we have to go back and read about it in 16th century books and figure out what the rules were for text underlay. All of this is performance practice. In the 17th and 18th centuries, much more is notated, but there's still an awful lot left up to the performer. Tempo, phrasing, bowing, choice of continuo instruments. The score says basso continuo, and, you want something that can play chords, maybe something else that just plays a bass line, maybe a whole bunch of instruments. There were traditions in different genres and places, but we have to learn about that. To say nothing of ornamentation. If you play music, Baroque music, it was expected that performers would just add a whole bunch of embellishments, ornaments that weren't written. And tuning and pitch, A equals 440 hertz, that's a modern idea. In those days, if you went to the next town carrying your instrument, you were going to have to retune it, because pitch was different all over the place. And tuning systems, the idea of equal temperament where all the half steps are equal, that comes up in the 18th century, but they've still got a whole bunch of other tuning systems going on in the 18th century. And before that, they've got different tuning systems. So that's something we also have to learn and apply as performance practice. Now, here's the kicker. The term performance practice did not exist until the early 20th century. The Germans invented it. It has to be the Germans, Aufführungspraxis. And then the American scholars took it up as well. The very idea of trying to resurrect old playing styles was brand new in the late 19th century. Dolmetsch probably had a lot to do with it. He's providing all these instruments and he started reading up about them and how you play them. And as I say, he got a lot of it wrong, but he tried to write about performance practice. So what did people do instead before they thought anything about performance practice? The only thing they knew how to do. They played old music in the only style they knew, their own style. So what do we get? A whole bunch of music from the Middle Ages through the late 18th century in the heavy romantic musical style of the 19th century. Bach's Matthew Passion sounded like Mendelssohn. And that was what he was expected to do, He completely reorchestrated. It was, there were trombones, all kinds of things, and an enormous chorus. So the introduction of historical performance practice as a technique and goal was revolutionary. And it became, and it still is, a major discipline in 20th century music studies engaged in by performers and musicologists alike. So what's the evidence? Obviously, I don't have time to go into details about particular issues of performance, but just in general, what's the evidence? Before the early 20th century, we don't have audio recordings, so we can't listen to the music. There are treatises, books where learned people of the time explain things about music. There were what we call tutors, which are teaching books, a book that tells you, here's how you hold your bow, here's how to count. And counting was different, by the way. So it's good that we get to read about how they counted. There are letters and anecdotes, including negatives. I study Lully. So many people at the time wrote that Lully did not allow performers to add ornaments. What that tells me is that left to their own devices, they added ornaments. And there are some implications in the musical notation. There is a raging controversy about how many people sang each part in Bach's choir. The one on a part theory, which I will say right up front I subscribe to, bases most of its ideas on the way the music appears in the score. Nothing's explicit. It doesn't say one soprano, one alto, but the way the music appears tells people, hey, this tells us one on a part. And then there are other things that we know. that support that idea. Not everybody believes it. And another piece of evidence, written out versions of ornamentation. They are few and far between, but precious. Why did people sometimes write out stuff that was supposed to be improvised? Well, maybe for a student. Mozart's student needs to play a cadenza in this concerto, doesn't know how to improvise a cadenza. Mozart will write one out. Maybe as a souvenir publication. Monteverdi's opera Orfeo, when it was finally printed in score, who was that for? This is long after a performance. It was for people to buy the score and either remember it because they were there or know what it was like to be there and to hear this wonderful music. And in the middle, there's a great big aria that's shown two ways. Just the notes, as Monteverdi originally composed them, and then he himself, because he's the one doing the publication, puts in written ornamental version above it. Is this him after the fact? Is this him reporting what the famous tenor Razzi actually did? We don't know exactly what it represents, but it certainly tells us moderns how it might be done. Corelli, his violin pieces, a publisher in Amsterdam, Etienne Roger, publishing the sonatas and concerti, said, I went to a concert and I heard Corelli perform it, and this is what he did. So here's Roger taking dictation. Is it correct? Is it not correct? And it was what Corelli did on one particular evening. It might have been different the next night, but it gives us an idea. Here's how it might be done. And what happens with modern performers is, the first step is we play these versions that have been saved for us miraculously. And then we learn from that how to do it. So we can pick up that piece or other pieces and do our own. Sorry, I lost my place. So pictures. Whoops. What just happened? There we are. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, you almost never get written information about what combination of instruments and voices performed together. We are saved by the many, many pictures of little ensembles of, one singer and 3 instruments or something. We can see this must have been how it was done. So that helps us to know. But we have to be careful, because not every artist knows anything about music. So I've got 2 images there. On the left, you can see the hands and fingers in 2 paintings of lutanists, as shown in a journal article. I just did a screenshot from this journal article. They're so detailed and careful, the way those fingers are shown, that the author of the article felt confident trusting these paintings as a representation of lute technique. And I think I agree. Then on the right, this is a famous example. This is one we do not trust. Maybe angels engaged in crossbody bowing, but surely human beings didn't. One of the big issues in performance practice of the 17th and 18th centuries that I've already referred to several times is ornamentation. By the 19th century, notation is much, much more detailed, because in the 19th century, the performer was regarded as a vessel to pass the composer's ideas on to the audience. That's not the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the performer was a co-composer. The performer was expected to finish the piece. And every performance was expected to be different. So we have the problem of adding detailed ornamentation. Sometimes, especially in keyboard music, the composers used symbols and left a table of ornaments. Not always. And sometimes it's hard to interpret what's in those tables, and people argue about them. But the best singers and instrumentalists who specialize in music of the period have somehow, by reading all this stuff, mastered ornamentation. And whether or not we as a community have gotten every historical detail right, the performers are very comfortable doing it. If you go to concerts, those of you who go to the early music in Columbus concerts, you know, they just do these ornaments as though it's their native language. And even if they prepare in advance, they somehow manage to make it look as though they're improvising in the moment. So I have here a clip of Philippe Jaroussky, the French countertenor, being interviewed on French TV. It's just a brief clip from that. Again, you can find the whole thing on YouTube. He is asked to sing a phrase. He sings a phrase from an aria, a famous aria by Handel, and to do it again, ornamenting it however he likes. So let's listen to that.
Est-ce que tu peux nous donner un exemple d'ornementation improvisée?
Oui, sur une phrase.
Donc il faut commencer par une phrase sans ornement pour que les téléspectateurs comprennent bien, d'accord?
Et un des grands tubes de Handel.
Et maintenant le même air, et tu improvises ce que tu veux.
I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to get rid of the AI-produced subtitles that are so weird, but I hope you figured that out and ignored them. All right. The slide promises you an excursion about countertenors and castrato roles, so I'm going to do that for a moment. There is today an army of countertenors. Jaroussky is by no means alone, who specialize in music originally written for the castrato voice. I mean, we obviously have a problem. We no longer mutilate children, so there are no adult castratos floating around. And it seems a reasonable solution, use a countertenor. But it's not historical. This is a situation where we know it's not historical. The evidence is there. What did they do in the 17th and 18th centuries if the castrato was out sick or didn't manage to make it to the venue on time? They used a woman. They dressed her in man's clothes and put her out on the stage, and she sang the role. That was what they did. And sometimes it happens now. But we have this flood of virtuoso countertenors doing this wonderful stuff. So we're all fine with this. I mean, we know it's not historical, but we love listening to them. It's lovely. We're not going to tell them to go do something else. It's an interesting phenomenon. And I will tell you that the countertenor doing these roles is a whole lot better than what happened in the 1960s, which was transposing the part down an octave so a tenor could sing it. That wrecks the music. I mean, think about it. A love duet is two sopranos right there, intertwined, making close dissonances. A ninth is not the same as a second, for those of you who know intervals. So I'm happy to hear the countertenors doing this. If you want to hear countertenor singing something that is historically accurate for countertenors, Purcell, the British late 17th century composer Henry Purcell. You can find stuff on YouTube. Purcell himself, my phone is ringing, that's terrible. He was a countertenor. He worked with virtuoso countertenors in the Royal Chapel in London. You can feel confident when you hear a countertenor singing Purcell that that's for real, that's historical. Back to the general topic of performance practice. Well, the information is often unclear or contradictory. I gave you the example early in the lecture of note inégale in France, the unequal notes. There's lots of scholarly disagreement on just how they were used. We know they were used. Somebody wrote half a book on all the different things people in the 17th and 18th centuries say about how to do note inégale. What I learned by reading that was that they must not all have done it the same way. And we'll never know how Mouret did it among all those possibilities. Another problem is the subjectivity of talking about music. Anyone who's ever been to an orchestral rehearsal has seen the director give nonverbal cues to the players. Sometimes he sings, sometimes he just raises a shoulder. I mean, they do these little things and the players know and they change something. So some of the evidence for performance practice is precise and scientific. A lot of it just refers to feelings. So my example here is Giulio Caccini, a wonderful singer from the very early Baroque, the beginning of the 17th century. His book, Le Nuove Musiche, the new music, long discursive discussion about how to represent emotion, the affetti in song. He gives a table of ornaments and we argue about what some of what's in the table means. And then he says the music should be sung with sprezzatura. Well, Baldassare Castiglione, earlier in the 16th century, the Book of the Courtier, 1528, used the word sprezzatura to refer to artful nonchalance, how a courtier should behave, artful nonchalance. Caccini doesn't seem to mean that. He seems to mean speaking in song. We think we understand because we have other things to read and we have his whole book to read. We think that what he means is allowing for some freedom in dissonance treatment and in rhythm. Negligence. Caccini could have made it clearer instead of just throwing the word sprezzatura at us. But I want us to listen to Montserrat Figueras singing one of the pieces from Le Nuove Musiche. And I almost wrote with sprezzatura, question mark, and then I changed it to surely with sprezzatura. It's gorgeous. The poem is by Guarini. The words are those of a bereft lover leaving the woman who doesn't love him back. So let's listen to that.
Porta
That last cadential ornament before I cut it off is what Caccini calls a trillo. We used to call it the goat's trill. That's her take on how to do it. Other people have different takes on how to do it. I think it's lovely the way she did it. Okay. I have a personal anecdote I want to tell now, and then I'm going to play some video to go with it. The viola da gamba and Baroque cello player John Shu gave a lecture in the 1980s that I heard, and he mentioned how taken he was by a particular feature of Baroque dance, the way the dancers go up on the balls of their feet on downbeats, not every downbeat, but most downbeats. And he did a gesture when he was lecturing, up. And he said that, made him, that was evocative for him, for how to play. Well, it was a passing remark. He didn't really go into it. And years later, I thought about it and realized I had no idea what he was saying. He surely wasn't saying that in early music performance, we de-emphasize downbeats, because we don't. Richard Cheruskin has referred to downbeat bashing. Doesn't seem to be about bowing or phrasing. If John Shu were still alive, I would ask him what he meant. But here's another case of somebody dealing in feelings up without really saying what that meant for him as a performer of music. And so here's a bit of a Baroque dance, a popular Baroque dance from the early 18th century. And you can see it's in triple meter, so you can count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and on the ones, how often they go up on the toes for the downbeats. You will also get some close-ups of a Baroque flutist, and the musicians in the room will be amused by the way the director signals to the flutist to start. Let's watch it. Video? Yeah. with some nice added ornaments by the flutist as a bonus. I probably should have just played an excerpt from that because this is a long lecture, but I couldn't bring myself to cut it off. Sorry about that. So as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, all of these trends continue, finding new repertoire, experimenting with old instruments, studying performance practice. A new era for the early music revival, when it really became a movement, starts around the 1950s. I am going to bypass the Vivaldi revival in Germany in the 1950s with mechanical terrace dynamics and ornaments so that people talk now about the sewing machine style. We'll just not talk about that. We're going to move right on to the play of Daniel. This is 1958. Noah Greenberg was a musicologist and performer, the leader of the New York Pro Musica. He did not discover this 13th century manuscript. A French scholar had written about it, but he was very taken by it, telling the Bible story of Daniel, his faithful service in Babylon, his interpretation of the writing on the wall for the king, his survival in the lion's den. It's an evocative story. And so he made a performance. Very colorful costumes, colorful action. No effort at all toward historical authenticity. It was an imagination of the Middle Ages. He put on a show. That's what he wanted to do. A British musicologist writing in 1978, using the great British idiom to tart up, a prostitute covered with makeup, he writes, the well-known tarted up performance of the medieval play of Daniel, a performance that included a fire eater, lots of amazing instruments, jolly dances, and featured modern vocal techniques. Oh, how I wished for a few medieval singers. The instruments, though, actually were real. He had a keyboard instrument imported from Germany. And that part was okay, but the rest of it was just, let's invent the Middle Ages. It became extremely famous. Contributing to its fame, first of all, New York City. You put on a show that's a good show in New York City, there are a lot of people available to come and to talk about it and to write about it in the papers and all of that. Secondly, it came at just the right time for technology. TV was a recent invention. Play of Daniel was on television. It was even on Australian television. Third bit, the LP had recently been invented, the long playing record. I grew up on the West Coast, so nobody took me to see the play of Daniel, but I remember that record jacket. I didn't remember what was inside. I've since seen it and found out what was inside. A very learned set of liner notes with a page of facsimile of one page of the 13th century manuscript and a photo of the abbey or church or whatever it was where the thing was found, and a historical discussion and so on. So, I mean, this was a serious business. You can find on YouTube, not the 1958, but for some anniversary or another, the performance was recreated and a video was made, and you can find 8 or 9 minutes of it on YouTube. So the play of Daniel, more than anything else, begins the general public awareness of early music. Early music had been a few rarefied musicians and university people. There was something called a collegium musicum, basically an early music ensemble that cropped up in this and that university. So, this is not the general public. But with the play of Daniel, we start seeing early music ensembles starting all over the place. Even in Columbus, the early interval is now 50 years old. So it was part of that. A British scholar in 1978 said the categories of listeners have changed. It used to be serious music and pop music. Now we have three categories: classical music, pop music, and early music. I don't know if that applies to America, but I found that a fascinating idea, that there's this crowd of people going to early music where they get their own category. Another thing that happens, a fashion for performing in costume in the 1970s. There's a wonderful photo of the early interval all dressed up in Elizabethan garb. Well, Dolmetsch and his family sometimes dressed up in Elizabethan garb, but that's not why. It's because of the New York ProMusica, who performed in medieval costume, even when they weren't doing the play of Daniel, when they were just doing a stage concert. They would wear costume. So, why the popularity? Of course, it was a good show. People enjoyed it. But something was going on that made people receptive. And what more than one musicologist has pointed out is that the new music of our time, the music of living composers, has turned inward, catering only to an academic elite. So this new style, put new in scare quotes, of Baroque music played on period instruments in a refreshing, unfamiliar style was attractive. It filled a need. I think there's some truth to that. So the 1960s, we begin a real early music movement. New ensembles popping up everywhere. By the late 70s, we have stars and fan magazines and the whole business. But there's more. The next development is new ideas in building old instruments. Frank Hubbard was a harpsichord builder. He visited Dolmetsch, which had to have been in the 1930s because Dolmetsch died in 1940. But he visited him and he said afterwards that what he learned from Dolmetsch was how to make a beautiful piece of furniture. He didn't learn how to make a musical instrument. And what he realized is that what we have to do to make these instruments sound right is actually reproduce an old instrument. Because we don't know why the details are the way they are. Why did Stradivarius make this little place in the wood thinner than that little place in the wood? He didn't write a book, we don't know. But if we make our little place in the wood thinner, maybe we'll get the sound Stradivarius got. So Hubbard set out to do it that way. Now, can you just walk into a museum and say, "Hi, can I take apart your harpsichord?" Probably not. But he was hired by the Smithsonian to, fix their instruments, to work on their old instruments. And to do that, he had to take them apart. And so in the process of restoring the Smithsonian's instruments, he got to study all these old harpsichords. And he began building real replicas, reproductions of particular old instruments. And once that started, of course, people started doing it for all the other instruments. There are reproductions of old clarinets, old oboes, old everything. Violin's a little bit different because the body of the instrument stayed the same. We still have Stradivarius violins from the 17th century where the modern person is playing on an instrument where the neck has been changed and all the externals have been changed, but the body of the thing is the same. So what was involved there was restoring instruments to their original condition. And they did some of that, plenty of that, actually. Sorry. One of the things that was discovered when this happened was how good these instruments could sound and how, by comparison, how bad Dolmetsch's sounded. Dolmetsch was important in lots of ways, but we needed to move on from Dolmetsch. And then what really broke everything wide open, the consideration of instruments that have been in use all this time, Modern instruments, by modern instruments, we really mean 19th century instruments, don't we? Very few of them changed much in the 20th century. But take those instruments and build the old version, build the 18th century version of this modern instrument. That is a whole different thing. That means that the player of the modern instrument in a modern orchestra has to look over at you and say, are you taking my job? Probably not your job in a modern orchestra, but maybe your job in some other way. So all of a sudden there's tension. There are two camps. Some of what people said on the early instrument side was self-congratulatory. They didn't really need to talk this way. Christopher Hogwood, quote, I think it is reasonable to say that if there are 47 or however many messiahs in the record catalog, it's a good idea if just a couple of those actually reflect what Handel wrote or how he might have expected to hear it, unquote. So, you know, so much for all those people who wrote the other 45 performances. And then there's the other side, being dismissive. This is Friedrich Neumann, who is a musicologist. Quote, the way the authenticists make the use of period instruments the object of a categorical imperative, hence an issue of morality, oh my goodness, reveals a cultist trait of the movement. And this in turn explains the zealotry with which some of their followers demand conformance and condemn any questioning of their dogmas, unquote. Well, let's get specific about this. He had written about how bad Dolmetsch's idea of double dotting at the beginning of French overtures was, and he gave evidence. Neumann was right that we shouldn't be double dotting, but all the players who were used to double dotting and wanted to keep double dotting came down upon him, and that was his response. So the imagery is both religious and military. Henry Haskell, writing in 1988 on the spread of period instrument performance around the world, quote, steady if less spectacular gains have been registered in France, Switzerland, Canada, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Denmark. And early music beachheads have been established as far afield as Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Santiago, Vancouver, Toronto, Sydney, and Wellington. Beachheads. Quoting that passage, Peter Walls writes, quote, one imagines freedom fighters from local early music societies rushing on stage to saw the legs off the Steinway. Well, let's back up from all the controversy for just a moment. The reason instruments had changed, many by the beginning of the 19th century, others in the course of the 19th century. Ease of playing. If you take an instrument that didn't used to have valves or keys and you put valves or keys on it, it's going to make it easier to play. Sometimes that results in a general improvement. If you had to cover the hole with your finger, the hole had to be in a certain place. But if you could move the hole to someplace that made the sound better, and you had a key system that you could do that. So the person presses his finger down here and the hole gets covered over there. So to improve the instrument and make general ease of playing. Another reason, power. Big 19th century pieces, bigger orchestra, big halls. You had to fill this concert hall that no 18th century person ever had to fill. So we needed more powerful instruments. Hence, we get the Steinway piano. The example of violin bows and phrasing. The Baroque bow curves this way. The modern bow curves this way. The effect of that, besides other things, the modern bow is better at making a long, sustained line, which is great for 19th century music and the huge hall. The Baroque bow is better at short-breathed phrases. This is not to suggest that they can't each do the other if they want to. You can play both ways on both. But the instrument kind of encourages you to do one or the other. I have a great quotation here from Richard Cheruskin, channeling the National Rifle Association. He says, instruments don't play music, people play music. Right. But the real impetus for using old instruments was not morality. It was the simple belief that the best instrument for any piece is the one that it was written for. The composer is writing with a particular instrument in mind, a sound and a technique, and the best way to get what the composer had in mind was to play on that instrument. I'm going to go first to the bullet at the very bottom of this slide, then go back up. Pianos, a delicate, what we call a forte piano, the instrument of the 18th century, is not very great for playing Tchaikovsky or Liszt. But Bilson's point is that the Liszt piano isn't very good for playing Mozart. I've got 2 minutes here from a lecture of his. You can watch the whole lecture on YouTube, but here's a couple of minutes.
I think by crossing the strings and by crowning the soundboard and running the grain of the wood sideways, you get not just a bigger tone, but you get a very concentrated tone. And one of the things that you can do fantastically on these pianos is bring out voices. It's a wonderful effect. You can't hear the notes I'm playing in the right hand. You just hear the harmony. But it's very, very difficult to play democratically on such a piano. There are two voices here. Unquestionably, it's the left hand that's the good one. There's a Johann Christian Bach that has a tune that's just as good as Mozart's, but it starts with an aspiré. He could have written, it's fine, but this. Nobody plays like that. Of course, this is what people think Mozart is. This is, to me, completely emasculated and really robs the music of all of its drama. And if you play this is a very nice piano, and it's all smooth, and it's all nice, and it's fine, but I believe that the very soul of this music is in those things. Because every note in Mozart counts, and it's full of all this variety, and there it is.
The YouTube video says it was loaded 10 years ago. Bilson would have been 80 10 years ago, so I don't know how old the actual video is, but I will tell you he has been giving versions of this lecture since the 1970s. Okay. So the argument, the early music argument, really coalesced around the word authenticity. All of a sudden, that became a buzzword that people worried about. It really starts with marketing companies, people selling recordings, record jackets. The record jacket proclaims original instruments, authentic version. And the public adopts this idea uncritically. The debate became sufficiently intense that publishers quietly stopped with the over-the-top language. We now say period instruments, not original instruments. And the liner notes to a CD might say in small type, here's an example, Forte piano, copy after C. Groff, 1824, built by R. Regier, 1989. Okay. The scholarly debate on so-called authenticity started in the late 70s, and it was still hot and heavy through the 80s. I mentioned Truskin only because that article is the most quoted, but it's a huge, rich bibliography and very important. So what are the problems? Why can't we call what we're doing authentic? Of course, there's so much we can't know, and so much scholars and performers disagree about regarding the historical evidence. But I'm going to start with the external trappings. Listeners aren't authentic. We've heard Wagner. We've heard the Beatles. You know, we've heard Berlioz, whatever. We don't have authentic ears. In the 1970s, so-called period orchestras looked like modern orchestras. Instead of a casual grouping of players, many on their feet, led by a keyboard player or a violinist, there was a formally arranged orchestra conducted by a baton-waving guy in 19th century formal dress. The all-powerful 19th century conductor who still reigns supreme in traditional modern orchestras, and he had somehow invaded the 18th century. That's improved, thank goodness. You don't see that so much anymore. The concert environment isn't authentic, and this does last to the present day. We sit in straight rows. We applaud only when the 19th century taught us to applaud. Mozart, for the premiere of his Paris Symphony in 1778, wrote to his father, quote, "Just in the middle of the first allegro, there was a passage which I felt sure must please. The audience were quite carried away, and there was a tremendous burst of applause. But as I knew when I wrote it what effect it would surely produce, I had introduced the passage again at the close when there were shouts of da capo." So he expected applause in the middle of the piece, just like at a jazz concert, you know? As for going to the opera in the 17th or 18th centuries, by all descriptions, it was like going to a football stadium. People talked and they wandered around, and then when the important singer was going to sing the big aria, they all stopped and paid attention, just like the big guy doing the football thing. You stop and pay attention. So, but what about actual music? Those are the externals. What about the actual music? There's only so much we can know from the existing information on performance practice. Performers have to use their sensibilities as musicians to fill in the blanks, which is fine. That's what they should do. We want them to do that. And as Truskin and others have pointed out, we are products of our time. Our essential sensibility is that of the 20th century, now the 21st. I mean, it's where we live. We're all classical music was a huge reaction against the heavy emotionalism of 19th century romanticism. The early music performance that we moderns invented, we did invent it, is clean, precise, Stravinsky-esque, according to Truskin. And that's fine too. We just need to accept it. We're products of our time. So, where are we today? I think I need to go on. We avoid the word authentic. We talk about historically informed performance. Not everybody likes that phrase, by the way, but it's the most used. Historically informed performance. People don't say hip, they could. That's what we've been saying since the 1990s. More circumspect than authenticity. Moralizing is toned down. The sides get along. It's just fine that you can go to the Ohio Theater and hear the Columbus Symphony there, and then go to some church and hear early music in Columbus there. It's fine, we can get along. When Martha Moss conducted the early music ensemble here at Ohio State, she had visions. She came circa 1970, I think. She had visions of conducting a real early music ensemble with all the instruments, but that would have meant persuading her colleagues on the performance faculty to let their students play old instruments. to play with a Baroque bow, to play a sackbut instead of a trombone, they wouldn't hear of it. So it's going to ruin their technique if they work on old technique. And so by the time I came to Ohio State in 1985, her ensemble had been reduced to a teaching workshop for musicology students to learn how to play recorders and viols. There we are. Now, there is a video on YouTube. I forget exactly what pieces he's playing, but the Baroque violinist Shunsuke Sato, he's playing some Baroque piece or another with his Baroque violin and bow. During the applause, he puts them down and picks up his modern instrument and bow and goes on to the next piece on the program. No problem. The musicologist Nicholas Temperley, writing in 1984, summed things up very nicely, I think. There is so much that the study of historical information can't tell us. What performers have done inventively is, quote, build up a new style on the historical backbone. Let's call the style eclectic rather than authentic. So it's an admission that we've made something new. I should add a parenthesis here. Another thing that has happened in recent times that I'm not really talking about, the modern performers have borrowed ideas from the historical movement. So you see modern small chamber orchestras standing around a violinist leader or a harpsichord, whatever, and other ideas as well. And the original instrument movement has progressed its way through the 19th century. I think there's an original instrument performance of something by Verdi. But what some people have written rather caustically is that they're not thinking about style, about performance practice. All they're doing is substituting the instruments. When we get to the point that they recreate the Romantic style, that will be something, but we're not there yet. Anyway, that's a parenthesis. So what is the new 18th century style? Transparency and precision borrowed from modernity, plus a focus on the way 17th and 18th century writers about music referred to classical rhetoric. Understanding music as speech and pieces of music as speeches. There's been an enormous amount written about this based on the enormous amount written about it in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I should mention that this really started in the 1970s with Gustav Leonhardt and his colleagues in Amsterdam, introduced a new style of playing on old instruments, a rhetorical style of playing. Lots of rubato, very heavy expressivity. It's been toned down since. We're not hearing all of that. Currently, it's less daring. It's still expressive. Transparent texture, short-breathed phrasing, attack and decay, vibrato used only sparingly as an ornament. And actually, what I'm going to do is read a list to you that Bruce Haynes wrote of what constitutes the modern style, what you hear in the Ohio Theater, that style. And you can think of the historical style as the opposite of each of these things. So here's the modern style of playing. Seamless legato, continuous and strong vibrato, long line phrasing, lack of beat hierarchy, unyielding tempos, unstressed dissonances, rigidly equal 16th notes. Just turn all that upside down and you've got the historical style. Yeah, so I have a couple of examples here. This is a modern player, Hilary Hahn. all that smooth legato and vibrato. And now the historically informed version. who knows, maybe 20 years from now, they'll invent a new version and say we got it all wrong, and that'll be fine too. I think I have to stop there.
Before early music, what is ancient music?
Well, according to the French, early music is musique ancienne, but that's a different problem. We don't know very much about actual ancient music. There's very little music surviving from Greece and Rome. There's music theory surviving, but actual pieces of music, something else. We start to get little bits of music in the Middle Ages, the earliest Middle Ages. Some of them don't have any notes. Some of them have notes but no rhythm. We call that early music.
The instruments
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. The old instrument business has gone to town. Any instrument we know about has been reconstructed. I read somewhere about a fiberglass rebec. I can't quite imagine. I didn't tell you, and probably worth doing it, the reconstruction, the making copies of old instruments, there's always some little stuff they change. So Hubbard had to find a way to make the plectra that plucked the strings of the harpsichord that wasn't crow's quills, which is what they used in the 18th century. They're fragile and it's hard to get them. And he figured out that a plastic called Delrin could mimic the sound of a crow's quill. So there's a lot of that going on.
Thank you very much. This is certainly an area where we have little baseline information, and you obviously have spent a whole lifetime creating this body of knowledge. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And thank you all for coming today. Thank you for helping.
My pleasure.